June 6, 1944. Dawn over the English Channel. The darkness begins to dissolve into gray as the first light touches the water. Then, from the west, comes a sound unlike anything the world has ever heard. A roar that swallows the breaking waves, that drowns out the wind itself. It starts as a distant rumble, then builds into an apocalyptic thunder that shakes the ground beneath the boots of nervous soldiers waiting on the Normandy beaches. They look up. The sky is no longer sky. It has become metal, wing to wing, layer upon layer, stretching from horizon to horizon. Thousands upon thousands of aircraft fill the heavens. B-17 flying fortresses, B-24 Liberators, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, C-47 transport planes, British Lancasters and Spitfires. They come in formations so vast that German soldiers, crouched in their bunkers, can only stare in disbelief. One German officer, interviewed after his capture, would later say, "We knew we had lost, not in that moment. We had lost long before, in the factories we never built, in the production lines we never imagined. But on that morning, we finally understood what we were facing. It wasn't an army, it was an industrial apocalypse." By the end of 1944, the United States alone had produced over 96,000 aircraft in a single year. The Allies commanded the skies with such totality that Luftwaffe pilots called it Die Hölle, the hell. American factories, once mocked by Adolf Hitler himself as incapable of war production, had unleashed a torrent of machines that would bury the Third Reich beneath wings of aluminum and steel. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of the arsenal that won the war. Chapter 1. The Laughter in the Führer's Bunker. Berlin, December 1941. The ornate halls of the Reich Chancellery still gleamed with the confidence of conquest. German armies stood at the gates of Moscow. The swastika flew over Paris, Warsaw, Oslo, Athens. The British cowered on their island. And now, with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler had just declared war on the United States of America. In the war rooms, Hitler's generals expressed concern. America was vast, resource-rich, and had stayed out of the Great War for 3 years before tipping the balance. But Hitler waved away their worries with contempt. The Americans, he scoffed to his inner circle, a mongrel nation of shopkeepers and jazz musicians. They cannot build a real war machine. They are soft. They are divided. They are weak. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and head of the Luftwaffe, agreed enthusiastically. The American automotive industry makes toys, cars for their fat consumers. They have never built serious military aircraft. Our Messerschmitts will tear apart anything they send across the Atlantic. This wasn't just bravado. It was strategic doctrine. Nazi racial ideology had convinced Germany's leadership that American democracy, with its ethnic diversity and capitalist chaos, could never mobilize for total war. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, published editorials mocking American industrial capacity. They make refrigerators and phonographs. We make tanks and cannons. The contest is already decided. German intelligence reports from the 1930s reinforced these beliefs. Yes, America had enormous factories, but they produced consumer goods. The Reich's economists calculated that converting those facilities to war production would take years, perhaps a full decade. By then, Hitler believed Germany would control all of Europe and Russia, an empire too vast to challenge. Even the statistics seemed to support German confidence. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 18th in the world, smaller than Belgium's. American tank production was essentially zero. The U.S. Air Corps operated with outdated biplanes and a few hundred modern fighters. The nation's military budget was minuscule. Hitler saw a nation addicted to comfort, incapable of sacrifice. He could not imagine, his entire worldview prevented him from imagining what was about to unfold across the Atlantic. He should have paid more attention to history. He should have remembered that in 1917, when America finally entered World War I, it had mobilized with shocking speed. Within 18 months, the U.S. had transported 2 million soldiers to France and turned the tide of that war. American factories had produced artillery, vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition in quantities that stunned European observers. But Hitler dismissed that precedent. That was different, he told himself. That was a fluke. This time, Germany was stronger. This time, the Americans would face the full might of the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. This time, they would learn their place in the New World Order. In Washington, D.C., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat at his desk in the White House reading the intelligence summaries. He knew what Hitler thought. He knew about the mockery, the contempt, the dismissive laughter in Berlin. Roosevelt smiled quietly. He picked up his pen and began drafting a memo to his advisors. "Gentlemen," it would read, "they have no idea what Americans can build when we put our minds to it. Let's show them." Chapter 2. Arsenal of Democracy. The White House, December 29th, 1940. More than a year before Pearl Harbor, before America officially entered the war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat before a radio microphone in the diplomatic reception room. Across the nation, families gathered around their living room radios. The president's voice, warm and resolute, filled millions of homes. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," Roosevelt declared. "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war." He was preparing the country for what he knew was coming. Britain stood alone against Hitler. The Soviet Union would soon be invaded. If democracy was to survive, if freedom was to endure, America needed to become something it had never been before, a nation capable of producing weapons on an unimaginable scale. But Roosevelt faced enormous obstacles. The Great Depression had left deep scars. Unemployment still hovered near 10%. Many factories sat idle or ran at partial capacity. The military establishment was small and conservative, resistant to rapid expansion. Isolationist sentiment remained strong. Millions of Americans wanted no part in another European war. Most daunting of all, American industry had no experience with military production on the scale Roosevelt envisioned. The nation's factories were optimized for consumer goods, cars, refrigerators, radios, washing machines. Converting them to produce tanks, planes, and ships would require a complete industrial revolution, accomplished not over decades, but over months. Roosevelt assembled a team of industrialists, economists, and military planners. He called them his production generals, men like William Knudsen, the Danish-born president of General Motors, who took a government salary of $1 per year to lead the Office of Production Management. Donald Nelson, a Sears executive, who would head the War Production Board. Henry Kaiser, the shipbuilder who would pioneer new construction techniques that seemed like magic to traditional naval architects. These men looked at America's industrial landscape and saw possibility where others saw impossibility. Consider the statistics. In 1939, the United States produced 5,156 military aircraft. Germany produced 8,295. By 1944, America would produce 96,118 aircraft in a single year, more than Germany and Japan combined would produce in the entire war. But in late 1940 and early 1941, that transformation was just a dream on paper. The first challenge was retooling. An automobile factory and an aircraft factory operate on entirely different principles. Cars are heavy, use steel, and require precision machining but relatively simple assembly. Aircraft must be light, use aluminum alloys, and demand tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The wings must be perfectly balanced. The engines must achieve power-to-weight ratios that push engineering to its limits. William Knudsen walked through the Detroit auto plants with military engineers, and what they saw was simultaneously encouraging and daunting. The plants had enormous capacity, but almost none of it was immediately suitable for making bombers. "We'll need to start from scratch," one engineer reported. "New tools, new training programs, new supply chains for aluminum instead of steel, new assembly techniques. It's like building an entirely new industry." Knudsen nodded calmly. "Then that's what we'll do. How long will it take? 3 years, maybe 4 if we're lucky." Knudsen smiled. "You have 18 months. The engineer stared at him. "That's impossible." "Everything is impossible," Knudsen replied, "until it's done." Congress, pressured by Roosevelt and shocked by Germany's rapid conquests in Europe, began appropriating unprecedented sums for defense production. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940 authorized $4 billion for shipbuilding, more than the entire federal budget just 5 years earlier. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 committed America to providing war materials to Britain and other allies, effectively turning the nation into Britain's armory even before entering the war. American factories began the transformation. Ford Motor Company started producing Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines. General Motors shifted to manufacturing tanks, trucks, and artillery shells. Chrysler built the massive tank arsenal in Detroit. Even companies that had never touched military hardware, toy manufacturers, furniture makers, typewriter companies, retooled to produce ammunition, parachutes, and precision instruments. But these early efforts, while impressive, were just the beginning. The real industrial miracle wouldn't begin until after Pearl Harbor, when the constraints of peacetime economics vanished and the nation mobilized with a unity and purpose unprecedented in human history. Roosevelt addressed the nation again in January 1942, 1 month after America entered the war. His goals stunned even his supporters. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 in 1943, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1942, 35,000 in 1943, 8 million tons of shipping in 1942, 10 million in 1943. Critics called it fantasy. Even Roosevelt's own production chiefs privately thought the numbers were impossible. Charles E. Wilson of General Electric told colleagues, "The president might as well have asked us to build a bridge to the moon." But Roosevelt understood something his critics didn't. He understood that in moments of existential crisis, human beings and human societies are capable of achievements that seem impossible under normal circumstances. He understood that American industrial capacity wasn't limited by the factories that existed. It was limited only by the imagination, will, and determination of the American people. He was betting the future of democracy on that belief. In Berlin, German intelligence officers translated Roosevelt's production goals and presented them to Hitler. The Führer read the numbers and laughed out loud. "Fantasy," he declared. "Pure American fantasy. They are boasting to hide their weakness. Even if they achieved half these goals, which they won't, we will destroy their production with U-boats before it reaches Britain. This is propaganda, nothing more." His generals nodded in agreement. The numbers were simply too large to be real. No nation could ramp up production that quickly. It violated everything they understood about industrial capacity and economic mobilization. They would learn otherwise. But first, America had to build an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. It had to transform factories, train workers, invent new manufacturing techniques, and solve logistical nightmares that had never before existed. The miracle was about to begin. Chapter 3. Detroit and the Miracle of Willow Run. Ypsilanti, Michigan, 1942. Drive west from Detroit, past the factories and row houses, past the fields where farmers still work the land their grandparents cleared, and you arrive at a structure so vast it seems to defy reason. The Willow Run bomber plant stretches across the Michigan countryside like a monument to human ambition, half a mile long, quarter of a mile wide, covering 3.5 million square feet under a single roof. It is the largest room ever built, and every 63 minutes, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolls off its assembly line. Henry Ford, the man who revolutionized automobile manufacturing with the assembly line, has now applied that same genius to aircraft production. When Ford was first approached about building bombers, he was 78 years old, cranky, and skeptical. Aircraft were craft-built, he was told. Each one was essentially custom-made by skilled craftsmen. They couldn't be mass-produced like cars. Ford's response was blunt. Everything can be mass-produced if you design it right. He visited the Consolidated Aircraft Factory in San Diego, where the B-24 Liberator was being built using traditional methods. Skilled workers labored over each plane for weeks, fitting parts by hand, making adjustments, solving problems as they arose. It was quality work, but it was slow. Consolidated was producing perhaps one plane per day. Ford studied the process with the eye of a man who had spent decades thinking about production efficiency. He saw bottlenecks everywhere. Parts that didn't quite fit and required skilled labor to adjust, sub-assemblies built in place rather than constructed separately and installed as complete units, workers climbing over half-finished aircraft, wasting motion and time. "I can build one of these every hour," Ford announced. The aviation experts were horrified. "Mr. Ford, these are sophisticated aircraft, not Model Ts. You can't just watch me." Ford purchased 1,600 acres of farmland near Ypsilanti and began construction on Willow Run in April 1941. The factory would be so large it would have its own fire department, its own water treatment plant, its own internal transportation system. The assembly line would be so long that workers would use bicycles to travel from one end to the other. But building the structure was the easy part. The real challenge was reimagining aircraft production from the ground up. Ford's engineers broke the B-24 into sub-assemblies: wings, tail sections, fuselage, segments, engine mounts. Each subassembly would be built on its own smaller assembly line, perfected and standardized, then brought to the main line for final integration. Parts would be manufactured to such precise tolerances that they would fit together without hand adjustment. Jigs and fixtures would guide assembly, allowing less skilled workers to achieve results that previously required master craftsmen. It was heresy to traditional aircraft makers. It violated everything they knew about their craft. It was also genius. But first, they had to make it work. and in the beginning, it didn't. When Willow Run opened in 1942, it was a disaster. The factory was too big. Workers got lost. The supply chain collapsed. Parts arrived late or not at all. Quality control failed. Planes rolled off the line with defects. The workforce, many of them newly hired with no manufacturing experience, struggled with the complexity of aircraft assembly. Critics pounced. Newspapers called Willow Run Away, and Will It Run? The facility produced only one aircraft in its first month of operation. Skeptics said Ford had proven that aircraft couldn't be mass-produced, that the whole project was an expensive failure. Ford's response was to work harder. Engineers identified bottlenecks and eliminated them. Training programs were improved, supply chains were reorganized, quality control checkpoints were added at every stage of production. Slowly, inexorably, production increased. 2 planes per day, then 5, then 10. By 1943, Willow Run was producing B-24 Liberators faster than Consolidated's original factory in San Diego. By 1944, the plant was operating at peak efficiency, 1 completed bomber every 63 minutes, rolling off the line and immediately towed to the adjacent airfield for flight testing. The statistics are staggering. Willow Run would produce 8,685 B-24 Liberators during the war. At peak production, the facility employed 42,000 workers, operating around the clock in 3 shifts. The plant consumed so much aluminum that it had its own direct rail lines from bauxite mines in Arkansas. It used enough electrical power to supply a city of 250,000 people. But Willow Run was just one factory. Across America, similar miracles of production were unfolding. In Detroit, the Chrysler Tank Arsenal was producing M4 Sherman tanks at a rate that seemed impossible. 1 completed tank every 3 hours at peak production. The facility had been farmland in 1940. By 1942, it was churning out the armor that would liberate Europe. General Motors converted its factories to produce the Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber, Pratt & Whitney engines, and the 6-wheeled amphibious DUKW, the Duck, that would prove essential in every amphibious landing from Sicily to Okinawa. Packard Motor Company, known for luxury automobiles, was building Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license, the supercharged power plants that propelled the P-51 Mustang, the finest fighter aircraft of the war. Packard would produce 55,523 Merlin engines, many of which powered British Spitfires and Hurricanes. The scale was unprecedented. Consider these numbers. From 1940 to 1945, American factories produced 300,317 military aircraft, 80,710 tanks, 257,390 artillery pieces, 2,382,311 trucks and military vehicles, 5,277 merchant ships, 87,620 warships, 44 billion rounds of ammunition. The United States manufactured more war materials than all the Axis powers combined, Germany, Japan, and Italy together. American industry didn't just match enemy production, it buried it beneath an avalanche of steel, aluminum, and high explosives. But these achievements weren't just about factories and assembly lines, they were about people. Walk into Willow Run in 1943, and you see something remarkable. The workers building these bombers are women in bandanas and coveralls, welding fuselage sections with acetylene torches. They are elderly men who came out of retirement to contribute to the war effort. They are teenagers, too young for the draft, but old enough to work. They are black Americans from the South who migrated north for factory jobs, breaking through racial barriers that had stood for generations. One worker, interviewed by a reporter in 1944, said, "My husband is in North Africa, flying these planes against Rommel. Every rivet I drive, every seam I weld, I think about him. I think about bringing him home safe. That's why we work so hard. That's why we don't stop. The human cost was real. Factory work was dangerous. Workers were crushed by machinery, burned by welding accidents, injured by falls and collisions. Some factories reported injury rates as high as 10% of workers per month during the early, chaotic phases of production. Safety improved over time, but the work remained grueling. 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in factories that were hot in summer and cold in winter. Yet absenteeism was remarkably low. Workers understood what was at stake. Every plane that rolled off the line might save American lives overseas. Every tank might shorten the war by a day, an hour, a minute. Production wasn't just a job, it was a sacred duty, and the results spoke for themselves. In Germany, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, studied the intelligence reports coming from America with growing alarm. In 1943, he presented Hitler with an analysis showing that American industrial production was exceeding German production by a factor of 3 to 1 in most categories, 5 to 1 in others. Hitler refused to believe it. The numbers are exaggerated. Our intelligence has been deceived by American propaganda. Speer persisted. Mein Führer, these figures are corroborated by multiple sources. We are counting the aircraft they're sending to Britain, the tanks we're capturing in North Africa, the ships we're sinking in the Atlantic. The numbers are real. America is outproducing us catastrophically. Hitler waved him away. Then we will work harder. German workers are superior. We will match them. But Germany couldn't match them. The Reich was fighting a multi-front war. Its factories were being bombed. Its resources were stretched thin. Germany produced excellent weapons, the Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet fighter, but in quantities too small to matter against the American tide. By 1944, the disparity was crushing. Germany produced 39,807 aircraft that year. America produced 96,318. The Luftwaffe was being shot out of the sky faster than German factories could replace the losses. The mockery had turned to ash in Hitler's mouth. The nation of shopkeepers had become an industrial juggernaut that would grind the Third Reich into dust beneath its treads and bury it beneath its wings. But perhaps the greatest symbol of American industrial might wasn't a single factory or a single weapon system. It was the collective achievement, the transformation of an entire nation into the arsenal that Roosevelt had envisioned. On the factory floors, the workers knew it. In the skies over Germany, the bomber crews knew it. In the halls of power in Washington, the planners knew it. And in Berlin, despite Hitler's denial, the German leadership knew it too. The war was still far from over. The beaches of Normandy had yet to be stormed. The Bulge had yet to be fought. Millions more would die before victory came. But by 1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. America's factories had made the verdict certain. They had built the machines that would win the war. Nürnberg, Chapter 4, Rosie the Riveter and the Women Who Built Victory. Oakland, California, 1943. Her name was Rose Will Monroe, and she was 19 years old when she went to work at the Willow Run bomber plant. She was a widow. Her husband had died in a car accident shortly before Pearl Harbor, with 2 young daughters to support. The job welding fuselage sections on B-24 Liberators paid $0.90 per hour, far more than she could earn as a waitress or seamstress. She was good at it. Very good. When a Hollywood film crew visited Willow Run in 1943, looking for footage for a war bonds promotional film, they noticed Rose working with swift precision, her welding torch sparking against the aluminum skin of a bomber. She was photogenic, confident, and embodied exactly what the government wanted to show: American women building the weapons of victory. They asked her to be in the film. She agreed. The resulting footage showed Rose, now Rosie, riveting fuselage panels while narration explained how American women were filling the factories, releasing men for combat duty while maintaining production at peak levels. The image was powerful: a woman in work clothes, bandana over her hair, doing a job that before the war had been considered too difficult, too technical, too masculine for female workers. The film was shown in theaters across America as part of war bonds campaigns. Soon, the name Rosie the Riveter became synonymous with the millions of women who had entered the industrial workforce. But Rose Will Monroe was just one face of a revolution that was transforming American society as profoundly as it was transforming American industry. In 1940, fewer than 12 million women worked outside the home, representing about 25% of the American workforce. By 1945, that number had grown to over 19 million, nearly 37% of the workforce. More than 6 million of these women took jobs in war industries, many of them in positions that had been exclusively male before the war. They welded, they riveted, they operated cranes and lathes and drill presses. They assembled aircraft engines, loaded artillery shells, inspected bomb fuses. They worked on assembly lines building tanks, trucks, and jeeps. They became electricians, machinists, crane operators, and inspectors. And they did it as well as men had, sometimes better. At the Vega Aircraft Corporation in California, women made up 90% of the workforce by 1943. Managers initially worried that female workers wouldn't have the physical strength or technical skill for aircraft assembly. Those worries evaporated within weeks. Women proved to be exceptional at tasks requiring precision and patience. Their smaller hands could reach into tight spaces in aircraft fuselages. Their attention to detail caught defects that male workers sometimes missed. One supervisor at a Boeing plant in Seattle reported, "We were told women couldn't read blueprints, couldn't handle heavy tools, couldn't work on assembly lines for 10 hours a day. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. Our female workers have lower absenteeism, fewer accidents, and higher quality scores than our male workers did before the war." But the revolution wasn't easy, and it wasn't without conflict. Many male workers resented the arrival of women in their factories. Union leaders worried that employers would use female labor to drive down wages. Women typically earned 60–70% of what men earned for the same work, even in war industries. There was sexual harassment, discrimination, and hostility. Some men sabotaged women's tools, hid their safety equipment, or deliberately gave them incorrect instructions. Most women persisted anyway. They needed the money. They wanted to contribute to the war effort, and many of them discovered that they genuinely enjoyed factory work, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the satisfaction of building something tangible and important. Deli Hain, a welder at Marin Ship in Sausalito, California, later recalled, "I loved the shipyard. I loved being around all those big hunks of steel. I was 23, and I'd never imagined I could do something like that. When we launched a ship I'd worked on, watching it slide into the water, there's no feeling like that. You built something that mattered. You did something real." The cultural impact was profound. Before the war, American society assumed that women were unsuited for industrial work. Too delicate, too emotional, too focused on home and family. The war demolished those assumptions. When 6 million women proved they could build aircraft and ships and tanks as well as men, the argument that women were inherently less capable collapsed. This wasn't lost on the women themselves. Having tasted independence, having earned good wages, having proved their capability in men's work, many women were reluctant to return to domestic life when the war ended. The return of male veterans in 1945–46 forced most women out of industrial jobs. Employers explicitly prioritized hiring returning servicemen, but the experience of the war years had planted seeds that would grow into the feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s. But during the war itself, the focus was on production and victory. Consider Naomi Parker Fraley, who worked at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California. A photograph of her, wearing a polka dot bandana and operating a lathe, became one of the iconic images of women's war work. Decades later, many people would confuse her image with the famous "We Can Do It" poster featuring a muscular woman in a bandana flexing her bicep. The image now universally associated with Rosie the Riveter, though the poster was actually created by J. Howard Miller for Westinghouse and wasn't widely seen during the war itself. Naomi's photograph, though, captured something authentic. She was beautiful, yes, but also clearly competent, focused, professional. The machine shop around her was grimy and industrial. This wasn't a staged propaganda photo. This was a woman doing real work. When interviewed in 2009, shortly before her death, Naomi reflected on those years. "We had a job to do. We didn't think about whether it was women's work or men's work. We thought about winning the war. My husband was in the Navy. So were my brothers. Every one of us on that factory floor had someone we loved in danger overseas. That's why we worked so hard. That's why we didn't complain about the long hours or the difficult conditions. You didn't dare complain, not when you knew what the men in uniform were going through." The statistics bear out her story. In 1944, American defense industries employed over 2 million women in aircraft manufacturing alone. Women made up 40% of workers at Boeing, 65% at Douglas Aircraft, 90% at Vega. At the height of production, women were building more than 1,500 aircraft per week. But aircraft weren't the only critical sector. Women also entered shipbuilding in massive numbers. Before the war, shipyards employed virtually no women. By 1943, women comprised 10% of shipyard workers, which sounds small until you realize that American shipyards employed nearly 2 million people at peak production. 200,000 women were building the cargo ships, destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers that would win the war at sea. The most famous shipbuilder was Henry Kaiser, whose yards pioneered the Liberty ship, a mass-produced cargo vessel designed to be built in just 42 days using prefabrication and welding instead of riveting. Kaiser's yards hired women extensively. His recruitment posters showed women welding, operating cranes, and building ships, with slogans like, "The girl he left behind is not behind." Kaiser also pioneered workplace innovations that made it possible for women with children to work in factories. His shipyards in Portland and Richmond, California operated on-site childcare centers, the first employer-sponsored daycare in American history. Working mothers could drop off their children in the morning, work their shift, and pick them up in the evening. The centers provided meals, education, and health care. It was revolutionary, and it worked. Kaiser's yards had lower absenteeism among women workers than yards without childcare. Other employers took notice, though few matched Kaiser's commitment to supporting working mothers. African American women faced double discrimination, both as women and as black workers. Many defense plants refused to hire them at all, reserving jobs for white women. When black women did find factory work, they were often assigned to the dirtiest, most dangerous, and lowest paid positions. But they persisted. By 1944, over 300,000 African American women worked in war industries, many of them having migrated from the South to northern and western industrial cities. They were part of the Great Migration, a demographic shift that would reshape American society. One of them was Maida Springer, who worked in a garment factory producing military uniforms. She became a union organizer, fighting for equal pay and equal treatment for black women workers. In a 1943 interview, she said, "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking to do our part. Give us the chance to work, pay us fairly, and we'll prove we can do the job as well as anyone. That's all we want, the chance to serve our country." The contributions of women workers, white and black, native-born and immigrant, cannot be overstated. American production goals would have been impossible without them. There simply weren't enough male workers available, with 12 million men serving in the armed forces. Women filled the gap, and in doing so, they proved their capability beyond any possible doubt. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, every aircraft that flew over Normandy, every landing craft that hit the beaches, every tank that rolled through the hedgerows, all of it had been built, in part or in whole, by women's hands. Rose Will Monroe, the real Rosie the Riveter, worked at Willow Run until 1945. After the war, she returned to private life, raised her daughters, and rarely spoke about her wartime service. She lived quietly in Indiana until her death in 1997. But the image she helped create, the woman worker, capable and determined, would outlive her. Today, when we think of America's industrial victory in World War II, we think not just of factories and statistics, but of the millions of women who made it possible. They built the planes, they welded the ships, they assembled the tanks. They were half of the arsenal of democracy, and without them, victory would have been impossible. Chapter 5. The Aircraft Flood. When the Skies Filled with Allied Wings. 8th Air Force Headquarters, England, 1944. Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood at the window of his command center, watching the morning fog lift from the airfield. Across the English countryside, on dozens of bases, thousands of engines were already roaring to life. B-17s and B-24s, their aluminum skins still glistening with morning dew, were being loaded with bombs for the daily missions into occupied Europe. 3 years ago, this would have been unimaginable. In 1941, the United States Army Air Forces could barely muster 1,000 combat aircraft. Now, in the spring of 1944, Doolittle commanded more than 4,000 bombers and fighters in England alone, and that was just the 8th Air Force. The 9th Air Force, the 12th, the 15th, all told, the U.S. had deployed more than 15,000 aircraft to the European theater. And they kept coming. Every week, more bombers and fighters arrived from America. Every week, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy that was larger, better equipped, and more numerous than the week before. Doolittle picked up a logistics report from his desk. In March 1944 alone, American factories had delivered 8,718 aircraft to the military, 287 per day. The report included a note from the War Production Board. Production continues to exceed targets. Storage facilities at domestic airfields are at capacity. Recommend accelerating overseas deployment. Too many planes. America was building aircraft faster than the military could deploy them. Doolittle laughed quietly. It was a problem he was happy to have. The aircraft flood, that's what historians would later call it, the absolute deluge of American-built aircraft that buried the Axis powers beneath wings and engines and ordnance. It was the most visible and dramatic proof of American industrial power, and it changed the nature of warfare itself. Consider the numbers. In 1939, Germany produced 8,295 military aircraft. Japan produced 4,467. The United States produced 5,856. By 1944, United States, 96,318 aircraft. Germany, 39,807 aircraft. Japan, 28,180 aircraft. America alone was producing more than Germany and Japan combined, but raw numbers only tell part of the story. American aircraft were also better, more reliable, longer-ranged, better armed, and supported by a logistics system that kept them flying. The variety was staggering, American, factories built. Heavy bombers. B-17, Flying Fortress, 12,731 produced. B-24, Liberator, 18,482 produced, the most produced American military aircraft in history. B-29, Super Fortress, 3,970 produced, the most advanced bomber of the war, capable of flying higher and farther than any other. Medium bombers. B-25, Mitchell, 9,816 produced. B-26, Marauder, 5,288 produced fighters. P-51, Mustang, 15,486 produced, the fighter that won the air war over Germany. P-47. Thunderbolt, 15,686 produced, the toughest fighter of the war. P-38. Lightning, 10,037 produced, P-40. Warhawk, 13,238 produced, carrier aircraft. F-6F. Hellcat, 12,275 produced, the fighter that destroyed Japanese naval aviation. F-4U Corsair, 12,571 produced. TBF Avenger, 9,839 produced. SBD Dauntless, 5,936 produced. Transport aircraft. C-47 Skytrain Dakota, 10,123 produced, the workhorse that carried paratroopers, supplies, and wounded soldiers. C-46 Commando, 3,181 produced. And these were just the major types. American factories also produced thousands of trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, patrol bombers, and specialized variants. But quantity alone wasn't enough. The aircraft had to reach the combat zones, and they had to be kept flying once they got there. This required a logistics system of unprecedented complexity. Consider the journey of a single B-24 Liberator from Willow Run to combat in Europe. The bomber rolls off the assembly line in Michigan, towed to the adjacent airfield. A ferry crew, often including women pilots from the Women Air Force Service Pilots (WASP) program, flies it to a modification center where additional equipment is installed. Extra armor, updated radios, specialized bomb sights. From there, it flies to a staging base on the East Coast. After final inspections, the bomber makes the transatlantic crossing, usually via the northern route through Newfoundland, Greenland, and Iceland. It arrives at a depot in England, where it's assigned to a specific bomb group. Ground crews install squadron markings, calibrate weapon systems, and conduct test flights. Finally, the bomber is declared combat ready. From factory floor to first mission, approximately 6 weeks. Now multiply that by 1,882 aircraft, just the B-24s. Then add all the other types. The organizational challenge was staggering, and the aircraft were useless without spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and trained crews. American logistics officers had to maintain supply chains that stretched across oceans, ensuring that every airbase had everything it needed to keep aircraft flying. At the peak of operations in 1944, the 8th Air Force in England was consuming 30,000 gallons of aviation fuel per bomber per mission, thousands of tons of bombs per day. Spare parts for constant maintenance and repair, oxygen for high-altitude flight, ammunition for defensive guns, food and housing for 200,000 personnel. All of it had to come from America, loaded onto cargo ships, transported across submarine-infested waters, unloaded at British ports, and distributed to dozens of air bases. The system worked with astonishing efficiency. Aircraft availability rates, the percentage of planes ready to fly on any given day, averaged 70-80% throughout 1944. Far higher than German or Japanese rates. American aircraft flew more missions, carried heavier bomb loads, and suffered fewer mechanical failures than their adversaries. The impact on the air war was decisive. In 1942, Allied bombing raids on Germany were small, infrequent, and ineffective. The RAF's Bomber Command operated at night, dropping bombs on area targets with limited accuracy. American attempts at daylight precision bombing were costly failures. Luftwaffe fighters and anti-aircraft guns tore apart the small bomber formations. By 1944, everything had changed. The aircraft flood had arrived in full force. On a typical mission day in the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force would launch more than 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by 800-plus fighters. That's 1/800 aircraft in a single raid, more than Germany's entire fighter force in the West. The Luftwaffe couldn't match those numbers. German factories were being bombed. Fuel supplies were dwindling. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. By mid-1944, the average German fighter pilot had fewer than 50 hours of training. American pilots had 400-plus hours. The skies over Germany became a killing ground for the Luftwaffe. In February 1944, during Big Week, a coordinated series of massive raids on German aircraft factories, the 8th Air Force flew more than 3,000 bomber sorties and 3,273 fighter sorties in 6 days. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 600 aircraft trying to defend against the onslaught. German fighter pilot Johannes Steinhoff, an ace with 176 victories, later wrote about facing American bomber formations. It was like throwing yourself against a fortress in the sky. Every bomber bristled with guns. The fighter escorts were everywhere. We shot down bombers. Yes, we did, but they kept coming. For every one we destroyed, 3 more appeared. We were drowning in aircraft. We knew we couldn't win. The psychological impact was devastating. German fighter pilots, once the elite of the Luftwaffe, became increasingly demoralized as they faced impossible odds. Many refused to engage American fighters, instead trying to slip through to attack the bombers. But the American fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang with its incredible range and performance, hunted them relentlessly. The P-51 deserves special attention. In 1943, it was fitted with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in America, which transformed it from a good fighter into the best fighter of the war. With drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other fighter could do. American production of the P-51 ramped up rapidly. From just 1,988 in 1943, production jumped to 8,995 in 1944. By D-Day, P-51s equipped most of the 8th Air Force's fighter groups. They achieved kill ratios exceeding 10.1 against German fighters. But the aircraft flood wasn't just about Europe. In the Pacific, American carrier aviation was destroying the Japanese Navy with equal effectiveness. The F-6F Hellcat, specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero, entered service in 1943 and quickly established dominance. American pilots flying Hellcats achieved a kill ratio of 19.1 against Japanese aircraft. The reason was simple. The Hellcat was ruggedly built, heavily armed, and produced in such quantities that American carriers always had numerical superiority. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American carrier aircraft shot down 476 Japanese planes while losing just 30 of their own. It was the death of Japanese naval aviation, and it was made possible by the aircraft flood streaming from American factories. Japanese commanders watched in despair as American task forces operated with impunity, their carriers launching strikes of 100-plus aircraft at a time. Japan's industry simply couldn't replace losses. American industry was replacing losses and expanding the fleet simultaneously. By 1945, the United States Navy operated more than 100 aircraft carriers of all types: fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan had 4 operational carriers remaining. The disparity was crushing. But perhaps the most important aspect of the aircraft flood was how it changed strategy and tactics. Before American production reached its peak, air commanders had to carefully husband resources. Every aircraft lost was a significant blow. Missions were planned conservatively. Risk was minimized. By 1944, American commanders could be profligate with aircraft. They could launch raids that would inevitably result in losses, knowing that replacements were already en route from the United States. They could sustain campaigns that would have been impossible with limited resources. General Curtis LeMay, commanding bomber forces in the Pacific, exemplified this approach. When he ordered B-29s to conduct low-altitude night raids on Japanese cities, an incredibly dangerous tactic, he accepted that losses would be high. But he knew that American production could absorb those losses while Japanese defenses could not sustain the effort to shoot down hundreds of bombers night after night. The firebombing campaign against Japan in 1945 was brutal and controversial, but it was only possible because of the aircraft flood. LeMay could send 300-plus B-29s on a single mission, lose a dozen aircraft, and launch another mission the next night with replacements already arriving from the United States. The Japanese had no answer. Their fighter force was being systematically destroyed. Their anti-aircraft guns ran out of ammunition. Their cities burned. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American B-29s had already destroyed most of Japan's major cities through conventional bombing. The aircraft that delivered those atomic bombs, the Enola Gay and Bockscar, were just 2 more B-29s from a production line that had built nearly 4,000 of them. Back in America, the production lines continued. Even in the summer of 1945, with Germany defeated and Japan on the verge of collapse, American factories were still producing 5,000-plus aircraft per month. Plans were already drawn up for the invasion of Japan, which would require 10,000 additional aircraft to support. It never happened. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The aircraft flood stopped. Almost overnight, thousands of military contracts were canceled. Production lines shut down. Workers were laid off. The great industrial machine that had built 300,000 aircraft in less than 4 years powered down. But the impact would last forever. American air power, forged in the factories of Detroit and California and Seattle, had changed warfare permanently. Future conflicts would be dominated by air supremacy. Nations that controlled the skies would control the battlefield. And it all began with the aircraft flood of 1942 or 1945, when American factories proved that industrial capacity could be the decisive weapon of war. In Berlin, in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, Albert Speer reflected on Germany's defeat. In his memoirs, written years later in Spandau prison, he wrote, "We lost the war in the factories. Every battle we won was meaningless because America could replace its losses and we could not. Every aircraft we shot down, they built 3 more. Every tank we destroyed, they shipped 10 more across the Atlantic. We fought bravely, but we were fighting mathematics, and mathematics always wins in the end." Hitler had mocked American factories. American factories had buried him beneath their output. The lesson was clear. Industrial power wins wars. And in World War II, no nation could match America's industrial might. Chapter 6. The Collapse of the Luftwaffe. Germany's Skies Lost. Berlin, January 1945. The boy was 11 years old, standing in the ruins of what had been his apartment building, staring up at the sky. It was midday, and he could see them clearly, silver specks at high altitude, hundreds of them, arranged in perfect box formations. American B-17s heading for the synthetic oil plants at Luna. No German fighters rose to challenge them. No anti-aircraft fire reached them. They flew through German airspace as though it were their own. His mother pulled him toward the shelter. "Come, quickly, before they drop." The bombs were already falling. This was the reality of Germany in the final year of the war. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been broken utterly. The skies over the Reich belonged to the Allies. German cities burned without defense. German armies fought without air cover. The industrial centers that produced Germany's weapons were systematically destroyed from the air, and Germany could do nothing to stop it. The collapse didn't happen suddenly. It was the culmination of a grinding war of attrition that Germany was always destined to lose, though Hitler refused to accept it. Let's go back to 1940, when the Luftwaffe was at its peak. During the Battle of Britain, German bombers and fighters hammered British cities and airfields. The Luftwaffe seemed invincible. Well-trained pilots, excellent aircraft, battle-tested tactics. Yep, Britain survived, barely. But the Luftwaffe remained a formidable force. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft in the first weeks of the campaign. German air superiority over the Eastern Front was total. But even then, the seeds of defeat were being planted. The Luftwaffe was designed for short, aggressive campaigns, blitzkrieg warfare. It wasn't built for sustained attrition. German aircraft production was substantial, but not overwhelming. Pilot training programs were excellent, but couldn't scale rapidly. When America entered the war, the strategic calculus changed completely. The numbers tell the story. In 1942, Germany produced 15,556 aircraft, a respectable figure, and more than Britain or the Soviet Union individually. But America produced 47,836 aircraft that year, and production was accelerating rapidly. By 1943, the tide had turned decisively. America produced 85,198 aircraft, Germany produced 24,807. The Luftwaffe was being outnumbered by an ever-widening margin. But raw numbers don't fully explain what happened. The Luftwaffe's collapse was the result of multiple compounding disasters. 1. The Battle of Attrition over Germany. When the 8th Air Force began daylight bombing raids in 1942, the Luftwaffe initially slaughtered the unescorted bombers. American losses were catastrophic. Missions with 20 to 30% casualties were common. The raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943 lost 60 bombers out of 291, a loss rate that couldn't be sustained. But here's what made the difference. America could sustain those losses. The bombers were replaced within weeks, the crews were replaced, the raids continued, Germany couldn't sustain its victory, every Luftwaffe fighter shot down, every experienced pilot killed represented an irreplaceable loss. German training programs couldn't produce pilots fast enough. German factories couldn't build aircraft fast enough. By 1944, when American long-range fighters like the P-51 began escorting bombers all the way to the target, the balance shifted catastrophically. Now Luftwaffe fighters faced not just bombers, but swarms of American fighters specifically hunting them. German fighter pilot. Losses soared. In the first 4 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 1,000 pilots killed or captured, and these were experienced pilots, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience. Their replacements had minimal training, sometimes fewer than 50 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. 2. The fuel crisis. Oil was Germany's Achilles heel. The Reich had limited natural oil reserves and depended on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline. These plants were enormous, complex, and vulnerable to air attack. In May 1944, the Allies began systematically bombing Germany's oil infrastructure. The results were devastating. German fuel production collapsed from 316,000 tons in March 1944 to just 107,000 tons by June, and continued to decline. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe was grounded. German fighter units had aircraft but couldn't fly them. Pilot training programs were cut back because there wasn't fuel for training flights. By late 1944, some Luftwaffe units were receiving fuel allocations sufficient for only 30-40 flight hours per month for their entire squadron. Meanwhile, American bombers could fly daily missions, American fighters could patrol aggressively. The disparity in operational tempo was crushing. 3. The destruction of German industry. As the bombing campaign intensified, German aircraft production came under direct attack. The factories building Messerschmitt fighters, Focke-Wulf fighters, and Junkers bombers were bombed repeatedly. Even when production was dispersed to smaller facilities and underground factories, the disruption was severe. German production actually peaked in 1944 at 39,807 aircraft, a remarkable achievement under bombing conditions. But quality suffered. Aircraft rolled off production lines with defects. Critical components were in short supply. Maintenance became increasingly difficult as spare parts dried up. And even 40,000 aircraft per year couldn't match American production of 96,000. 4. The collapse of pilot training. Perhaps the most critical failure was in pilot training. Before the war, Luftwaffe pilots received extensive training, 250-plus hours before entering combat units. By 1944, new pilots were being sent to combat squadrons with as few as 30 hours of flight training. The results were predictable. Inexperienced pilots were slaughtered by veteran American and British pilots. German loss rates accelerated. In some missions, half the German fighters that engaged Allied formations were shot down. The Luftwaffe entered a death spiral. Losses exceeded replacement rates, forcing even less trained pilots into combat, leading to higher losses, requiring even less trained replacements. There was no way out. 5. Strategic blunders. Germany's leadership made critical errors that accelerated the Luftwaffe's collapse. Hitler insisted on diverting resources to wonder weapons like the V-1 and V-2 rockets, which consumed enormous resources but had negligible military impact. The Me-262 jet fighter, potentially a war-winning weapon, was delayed because Hitler demanded it be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter. When the Me-262 finally entered service as a fighter in late 1944, it was too late and too few. Germany produced only about 400 Me-262s, and fuel shortages meant most never flew combat missions. American production of the P-51 Mustang alone was more than 15,000 aircraft. German air defenses were also mismanaged. Resources were wasted on elaborate flak towers and enormous guns that consumed scarce ammunition and steel. A more effective strategy would have been to produce more fighters and train more pilots, but Hitler was obsessed with propaganda and prestige projects. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe existed primarily on paper. German fighter units reported impressive numbers of aircraft, but most couldn't fly for lack of fuel. Experienced pilots were dead. Airfields were being overrun by Allied ground forces. On some days in February and March 1945, the 8th Air Force flew more than 1,000 bomber sorties without losing a single aircraft to German fighters. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The human cost was staggering. Of approximately 28,000 Luftwaffe pilots who flew combat missions during the war, more than 20,000 were killed. The death rate exceeded 70%, higher than almost any other military branch in any nation. These pilots fought bravely, often heroically. Many were not Nazis, but ordinary Germans serving their country. They faced impossible odds and knew it. By 1944, veteran pilots like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff were openly telling their superiors that continuing the air war was suicide. Galland, one of Germany's greatest aces, confronted Hermann Göring in early 1945. Herr Reichsmarschall, we have lost the air war. Our pilots are being killed by the hundreds. We have no fuel, insufficient aircraft, and no hope of victory. We must sue for peace. Göring, bloated and drug-addicted, refused to accept reality. We will fight on. The Führer has promised new weapons, new strategies. We will turn the tide. There was no tide to turn. The war was over. Germany just hadn't admitted it yet. When Allied ground forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they found hundreds of German aircraft sitting abandoned on airfields, out of fuel, out of parts, out of pilots. Some had never flown. They were towed away or bulldozed into scrap heaps. American soldiers walked through German aircraft factories and marveled at the sophistication of the equipment, the quality of the engineering. They built good planes, one mechanic reported. They just didn't build enough of them. That was the epitaph of the Luftwaffe. Excellent technology, insufficient quantity, and strategic defeat by an enemy that could outproduce Germany by factors of 3, 4, 5 to 1. In the final weeks of the war, a few German jets made futile attacks on Allied bomber formations. It was like throwing stones at a landslide. The 8th Air Force flew its last combat mission on April 25, 1945. By that time, there were no German fighters left to oppose them. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Luftwaffe was formally disbanded. Its aircraft were destroyed or captured. Its airfields were occupied. Its pilots went home, those who had survived. The legacy was clear. Air superiority wins wars, and air superiority requires industrial superiority. Germany had lost both, and that loss had been decided not in the skies over Germany, but in the factories of Detroit, where B-24s rolled off assembly lines every hour, and in the shipyards where thousands of P-51s were loaded onto cargo vessels bound for Europe. The Luftwaffe collapsed because American factories never stopped producing. That was the lesson Hitler learned too late. You cannot bomb your way to victory against an enemy who can build aircraft faster than you can shoot them down. Chapter 7. The day 100,000 planes took off. Symbolic climax. June 6, 1944. D-Day. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious invasion in history begins. But before the first landing craft touches the beaches of Normandy, before the first soldier wades through the surf, before the first shot is fired on Omaha or Utah or Sword Beach, the sky fills with aircraft. They come in waves that seem endless. Transports carrying paratroopers, gliders filled with infantry and equipment, fighters providing cover, bombers targeting German defenses. In the first 24 hours of D-Day, Allied air forces fly more than 14,000 sorties over the invasion zone, 14,000 aircraft missions in a single day, a number that would have been inconceivable just 3 years earlier, when America had fewer than 1,000 combat aircraft in its entire inventory. But D-Day isn't the symbolic 100,000 planes moment of the title. That moment, while not literally 100,000 aircraft taking off simultaneously, represents something more profound. The cumulative weight of Allied air power that by mid-1944 had become so overwhelming, so omnipresent, that it seemed as though the entire sky had been conquered. Let's understand what 100,000 planes actually means. By July 1944, the United States had delivered approximately 100,000 military aircraft to Allied forces worldwide since January 1942. Think about that number. In 30 months, American factories built and delivered 100,000 combat aircraft, an average of 111 aircraft every single day for 2.5 years. Some landed in England, forming the vast bomber and fighter groups of the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Some went to the Mediterranean, supporting operations in Italy and southern France. Some crossed the Pacific to island bases, preparing for the assault on Japan. Some went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Some equipped the Navy's growing fleet of aircraft carriers. By late 1944, Allied air forces could, if they had chosen to coordinate everything for maximum effect, have launched a single day's operations involving nearly 20,000 aircraft across all theaters simultaneously. That didn't happen tactically, but strategically, it was happening. Every day, thousands of Allied aircraft were in combat somewhere in the world. The psychological impact on Axis forces was crushing. German soldiers on the ground in France after D-Day reported that they never saw a Luftwaffe aircraft, only endless Allied planes. They moved only at night because moving by day invited immediate air attack. Supply columns were strafed. Artillery positions were bombed. Tank concentrations were destroyed from the air before they could engage Allied ground forces. One German panzer commander, interrogated after capture, said, "We didn't lose the battle on the ground. We lost it in the air. Every time we tried to move, Allied fighters appeared within minutes. Every time we assembled for a counterattack, bombers destroyed our staging areas. We were fighting blind while the enemy saw everything from above. How do you win a battle like that? You don't. Let's look at a specific moment that captures the symbolic weight of Allied air supremacy. August 7th, 1944. Operation Totalize, Normandy. British and Canadian forces are attempting to break through German defensive lines south of Caen. To support the ground offensive, Allied air commanders order a massive bombing attack. The plan calls for 1,020 heavy bombers, RAF Lancasters at night, American B-17s and B-24s during the day, to carpet bomb German positions. A German soldier who survived the attack described it in his diary. Hell opened above us. The sound was beyond description. Not individual explosions, but a continuous roar that shook the earth. The sky was black with aircraft. We could not count them. There were too many. Men went mad from the noise. Some shot themselves rather than endure it. I prayed for death because I could not imagine this ending while I remained alive. More than 3,000 tons of bombs fell in just over 3 hours. German defensive positions were obliterated. Entire companies ceased to exist. The survivors were shell-shocked, disoriented, unable to offer effective resistance. This was the power of Allied air supremacy, not just to destroy targets, but to break the will to resist through sheer, overwhelming force. Now multiply that moment by hundreds of similar attacks across multiple theaters. Multiply it by the daily fighter sweeps, the naval airstrikes, the transport missions, the reconnaissance flights. Aggregate all that activity, and you approach the symbolic meaning of 100,000 planes taking off. It wasn't one moment. It was the cumulative weight of sustained operations at a scale no one had imagined possible before the war. The strategic impact. The flood of Allied aircraft changed warfare in fundamental ways. 1. Strategic bombing became decisive. Before WWII, strategic bombing was theoretical. No one knew if you could actually destroy an enemy's industrial capacity from the air. Germany's industry was bombed for 3 years with questionable results. But by 1944, with sufficient numbers of aircraft and improved accuracy, strategic bombing became genuinely effective. German oil production collapsed. Aircraft production was disrupted. Transportation networks were paralyzed. The bombing didn't win the war alone, but it made German defeat inevitable by destroying the industrial base that sustained the Wehrmacht. 2. Air superiority enabled ground operations. From D-Day forward, Allied ground forces operated with the confidence that they owned the sky. German counterattacks could be identified and destroyed from the air. Allied movements were protected by fighter cover. Supply lines remained intact because Allied aircraft dominated the airspace. In the Pacific, the story was even more stark. American island-hopping campaigns succeeded because carrier aircraft provided overwhelming support to landing forces. Japanese defenders fought with courage, but no air cover, no resupply, no hope of victory. 3. Logistics and mobility transformed. The massive C-47 transport fleet, more than 10,000 aircraft, created unprecedented strategic mobility. Allied forces could airlift troops over impossible terrain, supply besieged positions, evacuate wounded soldiers. The Berlin airlift of 1948-49 would later prove the strategic value of this capability. During the war, transport aircraft kept China supplied over the hump of the Himalayas after Japan cut the Burma Road. They supplied British forces fighting in Burma. They dropped supplies to resistance fighters throughout Europe. Without this aerial logistics network, Allied operations would have been severely constrained. 4. Naval warfare was revolutionized. By 1944, aircraft carriers had become the dominant capital ships, replacing battleships. The Pacific War was decided by carrier versus carrier battles, where surface ships never sighted each other. Aircraft sank more tonnage than submarines, torpedoes, or naval guns. The Essex-class carriers, America built 24 of them during the war, each carried 90-100 aircraft. A single American carrier task force had more striking power than most nations' entire air forces. The human achievement. But behind all these statistics and strategic impacts were human beings. The pilots, crews, mechanics, and factory workers who made it all possible. Consider the life cycle of a bomber crew in 1944. A young man, average age 22, volunteers for the Army Air Forces. He undergoes months of training, basic training, specialized technical training, crew formation, practice missions. The training is rigorous, but nowhere near adequate preparation for combat reality. He arrives in England and is assigned to a bomber group. His first mission is terrifying. Flak exploding around the aircraft. German fighters attacking. The plane shaking from nearby explosions. Some crews don't survive their first mission. Most don't complete a full tour of 25 missions. But the ones who survive become remarkably skilled. They learn to trust their aircraft, their crew, their training. They develop tactics for surviving flak and fighter attacks. They become confident in the knowledge that they're part of an overwhelming force. A bombardier on his 20th mission over Germany later wrote, "The first missions, I was terrified every moment. By the 20th, I was still scared, but I was also aware that we were winning. Every mission, there were more of us and fewer of them. Every mission, we had better fighter escort. Every mission, the German flak seemed less accurate, like they were running out of ammunition. You could feel the momentum shifting. We were grinding them down." That was the feeling of fighting in an air force that had overwhelming numerical superiority. Individual missions were still dangerous, aircraft were still shot down, men still died, but the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. Compare that to German pilots in the same period. They flew without adequate fuel, without sufficient ammunition, often without radio communication because equipment was failing. They faced formations of bombers so large that shooting down 10 or 20 made no difference. They watched replacement aircraft arrive that were inferior to American designs. They saw their experienced squadron mates die, one after another, until they were the veterans training pilots who'd barely learned to fly. Despair replaced confidence. By late 1944, many Luftwaffe pilots refused to engage American fighters, instead trying to slip through to attack bombers, a tactic that rarely succeeded. Some German aces, their nerves shattered, were grounded. Others were killed in hopeless fights against impossible odds. The peak. November 1944. If there was a single month that captured the full weight of Allied air superiority, it was November 1944. In that month, the U.S. 8th Air Force flew 27,766 bomber and fighter sorties over Europe, an average of 925 per day. Add in the 9th Air Force, the 15th Air Force, and the RAF, and Allied air forces in Europe alone were flying 2,000-plus sorties per day. In the Pacific, Navy carrier aircraft, Marine Corps Air, and Army Air Forces were flying thousands of additional sorties, supporting operations in the Philippines and attacking Japanese positions throughout the region. Total Allied sorties worldwide in November 1944, approximately 75,000 turns for the month, or 2,500 per day. That's 2,500 combat missions every single day by Allied aircraft. Bombing missions, fighter sweeps, reconnaissance flights, transport runs, naval strikes, a relentless, grinding, overwhelming application of air power that the Axis had no answer for. This was the 100,000 planes moment, not a single event but a sustained campaign of air operations at a scale that was historically unprecedented and would not be matched even in later conflicts. The cost. But we must not forget, this achievement came at terrible cost. The U.S. 8th Air Force alone lost 4,754 bombers destroyed and 3,737 fighters in combat. More than 26,000 American airmen were killed in action over Europe. The RAF's bomber command suffered even worse. 55,573 killed out of 125,000 aircrew, a death rate of 44%. Every aircraft that rolled off the production line in America represented not just metal and machinery, but the lives of the young men who would fly it into combat. Some aircraft flew dozens of missions and brought their crews home safely. Others were shot down on their first mission, cremating 10 young men in a ball of fire at 25,000 feet. The workers at Willow Run and the other plants knew this. They knew that every rivet they drove, every seam they welded, might mean the difference between a crew coming home or dying over Germany. That knowledge drove them to work harder and to maintain quality, to never slack off even when exhausted. One factory worker, interviewed decades later, still wept when describing a letter she received from a bomber pilot. He wrote to thank us for building such a good plane. He said it had taken heavy damage over Berlin but got him and his crew home safely. He said we'd saved their lives by doing our jobs well. I kept that letter for 60 years. It reminded me why we worked so hard. The turning point. By December 1944, the war in Europe had just months remaining. Germany launched its last major offensive in the Battle of the Bulge, and the initial assault succeeded partly because bad weather grounded Allied aircraft. But when the weather cleared, Allied air power destroyed German armored columns so thoroughly that the offensive collapsed. One American soldier, surrounded during the early days of the Bulge, described the moment the skies cleared. We heard them first, engines, hundreds of them. Then we saw them through the clouds, P-47s, flights of them, diving on German positions. They made pass after pass, rockets and machine guns ripping into German tanks and troops. Within an hour, the German attack in our sector had stopped. The tanks were burning, the infantry had fallen back. We cheered ourselves hoarse. We knew we'd won.